Hollywood loves to brag about its westerns, but not every classic made it into the official Hall of Fame. Some of the sharpest, toughest, and most daring westerns of the 1960s were buried under studio politics, bad marketing, or sheer bad luck. But here's the thing, many of them still hold up better than the ones everyone remembers. So, which films were cast aside but deserve a fresh ride into the spotlight? Let's dig them up. Hombre, 1967. Paul Newman wasn't interested in playing it safe, and Hombre is proof. Based on an Elmore Leonard novel, the story drops Newman into the role of John Russell, a man raised by Apaches who's now treated as an outsider by the white passengers of a stagecoach. They look down on him until danger strikes, and suddenly he's the only one who can keep them alive. That setup alone makes it different from the usual cowboy hero story. But what makes Hombre unforgettable is its quiet menace. Newman plays Russell with ice in his veins, giving a performance just as hard-edged as his turns in Hud and The Hustler. The supporting cast is stacked too. Richard Boone slithers his way through as a villain you almost admire, and Martin Balsam delivers a layered take on a role that could have easily been a throwaway stereotype. Critics noticed, even Roger Ebert singled out the acting as uniformly excellent. What's wild is that Steve McQueen actually turned the part down, saying it reminded him of an earlier role. Later, he admitted he regretted it, calling it one of Newman's best performances. Even Sean Connery reportedly counted it among his favorites. But Hollywood never quite knew what to do with this film. It wasn't flashy enough. It wasn't traditional enough. And yet, decades later, it still cuts deep. Hombre is a sleeper western that proves the loneliest heroes can sometimes be the most memorable. Sergeant Rutledge, 1960. John Ford spent decades shaping America's idea of the West, often leaning on tired stereotypes. But with Sergeant Rutledge, he pulled a sharp left turn. This was the first Hollywood film to center on a black buffalo soldier, and it did so with intensity, dignity, and not a hint of comedy. Woody Strode plays the title role, a cavalryman facing a court-martial for murder. The setup is pure courtroom drama, but Ford uses it to tear into themes of race and justice that he'd largely ignored in earlier work. Strode doesn't just play Rutledge, he owns the screen. His monologue in the courtroom is one of Ford's quietest but most powerful scenes, a reminder that the director could still surprise people in the last phase of his career. Jeffrey Hunter, often dismissed as lightweight, gets his best shot here as Rutledge's defense officer, proving he had more range than the Hollywood machine ever allowed him to show. The pacing is lean, the tension is constant, and the subject matter is darker than anything Ford had done before. He'd later attempt another late-career racial reckoning with Cheyenne Autumn, but that film drowned in melodrama. Sergeant Rutledge, it hit straight and hard. Of course, the film didn't get the mainstream recognition it deserved. Hollywood wasn't ready to champion a serious Western led by a black actor, and Ford himself was caught between his old image and his late attempts to atone. Still, over 60 years later, Sergeant Rutledge stands tall as both a historical first and one of the decade's most underappreciated Westerns. If you want proof that Ford could still evolve, this is it. The Professionals, 1966. Sometimes a cast is so stacked you can practically hear the swagger in every frame. The Professionals gives you Burt Lancaster, Lee Marvin, Robert Ryan, Woody Strode, Jack Palance, and Claudia Cardinale, each one chewing through desert heat like it's their natural habitat. The setup is classic. A millionaire hires a crew of mercenaries to rescue his kidnapped wife from a Mexican bandit. But don't mistake it for formula. Richard Brooks directed it with grit, flair, and a sharp sense of betrayal. This isn't just an adventure, it's a masterclass in chemistry. Lancaster and Marvin crackle together, bouncing lines like they've been rivals for decades. Palance does what Palance does best, steal every scene without ever going over the edge. Ryan and Strode get less screen time, but they make it count, proving that even the so-called support roles were filled with heavy hitters. The action is brutal without losing style. The cinematography pushes everything through scorching desert landscapes, sudden floods, and relentless weather, giving it a lived-in texture most Westerns never bothered with. Roger Ebert once called it the best directed Hollywood film of the year, which is no small statement. So why did it fade? Timing. The Professionals came right before the Western genre exploded into revisionist chaos in the 1970s. Compared to what was coming, it looked like old-school adventure. But in truth, it was a bridge, a rugged farewell to the classic style, and a preview of the grit ahead. Forgotten by some, yes. But one of the best Hollywood ensembles ever put to film? Absolutely. Ride the High Country, 1962. Before Sam Peckinpah shocked the world with The Wild Bunch, he quietly dropped a masterpiece in Ride the High Country. On paper, it's simple. Two aging cowboys, played by Joel McCrea and Randolph Scott, take one last job guarding a gold shipment. But what Peckinpah did with that premise turned the film into a meditation on loyalty, betrayal, and the fading myth of the frontier. For Scott, this was the last hurrah. After watching the finished film, he decided to retire, saying he'd never top what he accomplished here. McCrea didn't bow out immediately, but would eventually leave on a similar high note. That gives the movie an almost haunting weight, like you're watching two legends tip their hats to the end of an era. The studio, of course, didn't get it. MGM buried the film on double bills, pairing it with comedies and dramas that didn't fit. Audiences literally walked out after Ride the High Country, skipping the supposed main feature. Once the studio caught on, they tried to repackage it, but the damage was done. And yet, the film endured. Critics slowly realized it was something special, and word of mouth kept it alive. James Drury once said the movie was magical, and he wasn't wrong. With Peckinpah's unsentimental eye and the quiet tragedy of two men out of time, Ride the High Country feels less like a Western and more like a eulogy for the West itself. Buried at first, but now rightfully remembered as one of Peckinpah's greatest. McClintock, 1963. What happens when you drop John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara into the Old West and tell them to bicker their way through a frontier comedy? You get McClintock, a rowdy, dust-kicking version of Taming of the Shrew. Wayne plays George Washington McClintock, a rancher caught in conflicts with everyone, settlers, tribes, government men, and most of all, his estranged wife Kate. O'Hara matches him line for line, and their chemistry carries the whole thing. Unlike Wayne's serious roles in The Searchers or The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, here he goes all in on slapstick. Director Andrew McLaglen and producer Michael Wayne wanted broad comedy, and they got it. Barroom brawls, pratfalls, and even mud fights. The film plays like a stage farce that just happens to have horses. But here's the kicker. This wasn't just a comedy for Wayne. He was recovering from major surgery, having lost a lung and 2 ribs. Most actors would have taken time off. Not Wayne. He insisted on doing his own stunts, including horseback scenes and physical gags. Dean Martin later said, "Duke just doesn't know how to be sick." That grit shows in every frame. The movie wasn't just a hit. It was a career stabilizer. Wayne needed a win after the financial stumble of The Alamo. And McClintock delivered. Yet despite its box office strength, it slipped into the cracks of film history, dismissed as fluff. But dismissing it misses the point. McClintock is Wayne cutting loose, proving he could still dominate the screen while laughing at himself. A buried gem with more kick than it gets credit for. The Sons of Katie Elder, 1965. John Wayne wasn't just proving himself. He was practically rebuilding himself when he signed on to the Sons of Katie Elder. At 57, he'd just survived major lung surgery, losing a lung and 2 ribs. Most actors would have retired quietly, not Wayne. He strapped on his boots and went headfirst into a revenge western filmed at high altitude, demanding to do his own stunts. The film itself plays like classic family melodrama with a western edge. 4 brothers come home for their mother's funeral, only to learn their father was murdered. That grief turns into a mission for justice. Wayne leads with Dean Martin at his side, bringing charm and grit in equal measure. Henry Hathaway's direction leans into the bleakness of the land, giving the story a grounded feel instead of the glossy polish of many mid-60s westerns. The production wasn't easy. Wayne's health made everyone nervous, but his determination set the tone. Dean Martin later said, "Someone else would have laid around feeling sorry for himself for a year. But Duke, he just doesn't know how to be sick." That stubborn resilience bleeds right into the film. At the box office, it was a solid hit, making back its budget multiple times over. But time hasn't been as kind, overshadowed by flashier Wayne films like True Grit. That's a mistake. The Sons of Katie Elder is one of those buried treasures where the context of its making is just as compelling as the story on screen. A family western with grit, tragedy, and Wayne proving once again why he was the iron horse of Hollywood. The Sundowners, 1960. Not every western takes place in the American West. Fred Zinnemann's The Sundowners moved the action all the way to Australia, trading dusty saloons for sheep camps and frontier towns. Robert Mitchum and Deborah Kerr star as a nomadic couple raising their son out of a wagon. He's content to roam forever. She wants to settle down. That push-pull drives the film, making it less about gunfights and more about the tension between freedom and security. Zinnemann fought hard to make the movie authentic. Studio boss Jack Warner wanted to shoot in Arizona to cut costs, but the director insisted on real Australian locations. That meant blistering sun, sudden cold rain, and 12 grueling weeks of shepherding shots before the actors even arrived. By the time Kerr and Mitchum showed up, production was a battlefield against the weather. Mitchum had to literally move onto a boat to escape mobs of local fans, while Kerr dug into the role with such conviction that she believed it was her best work. The Academy noticed. Kerr earned her 6th Oscar nomination for Best Actress, though she lost again, making her record for nominations without a win even more painful. Still, the film stands out as one of her career peaks. Mitchum, usually typecast as the heavy, shines as a stubborn but loving father figure. Today, The Sundowners is rarely mentioned, partly because it doesn't have the shootouts or blood of its American cousins. But that's exactly why it's special. It's a slow, atmospheric western with heart, anchored by 2 stars giving performances that deserved far more attention than they got. Lonely Are the Brave. 1962. Ask Kirk Douglas what his favorite role was, and he wouldn't say Spartacus. He wouldn't say Paths of Glory. He'd say Lonely Are the Brave. And you can see why. This isn't a showy epic. It's a quiet neo-western about a cowboy out of time, refusing to bend to the modern world. Douglas plays Jack Burns, a drifter who breaks into jail to free a friend, only to find himself hunted across the desert by helicopters and jeeps. It's less a traditional western than a man versus society tragedy. Burns isn't fighting cattle rustlers, he's fighting progress itself. That made the film radical for 1962, long before revisionist western was a term. Douglas poured himself into the role, and it shows in every line and gesture. He believed in the story so much that he blamed Universal for sinking it with a terrible title. He wanted to call it The Last Cowboy. Instead, a studio computer spat out Lonely Are the Brave. He hated it. The film didn't make money, though it earned respect overseas, and even a BAFTA nomination. The American Film Institute later recognized it as a landmark, but by then it had already slipped into cult status. For Douglas, it remained personal. He once joked it was better than some foreign nonsense about an actor chewing for 20 minutes. Lonely Are the Brave may not have filled theaters, but it foreshadowed the entire 70s wave of westerns about disillusioned men out of step with their times. For Douglas, it wasn't just another movie. It was the purest expression of what a western could be. Shenandoah, 1965. James Stewart had already defined an era of American cinema by the mid-60s, but with Shenandoah, he tapped into something different. The pain of a country divided. The film places him as Charlie Anderson, a Virginia farmer trying to keep his family neutral during the Civil War. They don't own slaves, they don't want to fight, but when Union soldiers take his youngest son, neutrality is no longer an option. What makes Shenandoah powerful isn't spectacle, it's intimacy. Stewart plays Anderson with quiet steel, a man who despises war but is forced to reckon with it anyway. His family dynamic drives the story, from his 5 sons to his daughters, all caught in the same storm. The chemistry between the cast is strong, grounding what could have been melodrama in raw emotion. Director Andrew McLaglen, better known for TV westerns, gave it a no-frills look. But that simplicity works. The pacing is deliberate, sometimes slow, but it builds toward a finale that refuses the Hollywood gloss. The ending lands with a gut punch, devastating in its realism, without the triumphant payoff most westerns offered. Audiences connected. The film was a hit in its time, but in the decades since, it's been overshadowed by flashier titles. Still, Shenandoah stands as one of Stewart's most overlooked performances of his later career, proving he could carry not just a western, but a war drama with grace and weight. It deserves to be remembered not as an oddity, but as one of the decade's most haunting buried gems. Fire Creek, 1968. If Shenandoah showed Stewart as a weary father, Fire Creek pushed him further, into the role of a reluctant sheriff, staring down real violence. In this brooding western, Stewart plays Johnny Cobb, a part-time lawman in a small town who's more used to handling Saturday night drunks than ruthless outlaws. Enter Henry Fonda, leading a gang that blows in and starts tearing the place apart. The tension is immediate. Fonda, usually cast as the noble figure, flips the script and dives into a dark, menacing villain role. His crew is stacked with familiar Western faces: Jack Elam, James Best, Morgan Woodward, and Gary Lockwood. The result is a slow-burn standoff where every scene feels like it could explode. Critics weren't kind at the time. They called it slow and wrote it off as another mid-budget programmer. But looking back, Fire Creek feels like a Western, ahead of its time. The grit, the moral ambiguity, the sense that violence is coming, whether you're ready or not, all of it points toward the revisionist wave that would dominate the 70s. Lockwood's performance in particular is chilling, playing a completely unhinged outlaw who steals every scene he's in. And when the final shootout arrives, it's clearly influenced by High Noon, but with an even grimmer edge. It may not have flashy style, but it has atmosphere. Fire Creek is about an ordinary man shoved into extraordinary danger, and Stewart grounds it with a quiet desperation that lingers long after the credits roll. Buried on release, but today, it deserves to stand tall with the darker classics of the era. One-Eyed Jacks, 1961. Marlon Brando only directed one film, and it nearly broke him. One-Eyed Jacks started as a Stanley Kubrick project, but when Kubrick bailed, Brando took the reins himself. The result? A Western dripping with atmosphere, betrayal, and raw emotion. Brando stars as Rio, a bank robber who's betrayed by his partner, played by Karl Malden. Years later, Rio comes back for revenge, only to find his old partner has become a respected sheriff. Brando wasn't interested in a tidy shootout Western. He wanted psychology, tension, and messy emotions. He shot on real coastal locations in California, capturing windswept cliffs and crashing waves that made the film feel more gothic than Western. He also blew through the budget, demanding take after take, sometimes over 30 for a single scene. Paramount panicked. By the time Brando turned in his version, it was over 4 hours long. The studio slashed it down to 2.5, leaving a compromised cut. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Some thought it was indulgent. Others saw the artistry. Over the years, though, One-Eyed Jacks built a reputation as one of the most visually stunning westerns of its era. Martin Scorsese and Quentin Tarantino both championed it. In 2016, it was restored and re-released, finally letting people see the beauty Brando fought for. For decades, the film sat in obscurity, half forgotten. But today, it stands as proof that Brando, even behind the camera, was incapable of playing it safe. Messy, yes. Brilliant, absolutely. Will Penny, 1967. Charlton Heston was known for playing larger-than-life figures, Moses, Ben-Hur, even a future astronaut. But in Will Penny, he stripped everything down. No spectacle, no grand heroics. Just a weary cowboy facing the end of the trail. Heston plays Will, an aging ranch hand hired for one last season of work. Alone, uneducated, and nearing the twilight of his life, He stumbles into an unexpected relationship with a widow and her son. It's not about gunfights or glory. It's about loneliness. Heston delivers one of his most vulnerable performances, playing Will as a man who knows he's out of step with the world, but still clings to what dignity he has left. Director Tom Grease leans into the melancholy, giving the film a quiet, elegiac tone that sets it apart from most 60s westerns. Of course, there's still danger. A vicious gang, led by Donald Pleasance, threatens Will and the family he's trying to protect. But even the violence feels secondary to the emotional core of the story. The true conflict is between Will's longing for connection and his awareness that the life he leads may never allow it. Critics praised Heston for playing against type, but the movie didn't light up the box office. It was too quiet, too sad for audiences expecting another epic. And that's exactly why it's special. Will Penny is a buried gem, a rare western that dares to look past the myth and show the human cost of living a cowboy's life. The Stalking Moon, 1968. Gregory Peck had already cemented himself as Atticus Finch, the ultimate symbol of decency. But in The Stalking Moon, he took on something darker and more brooding. Peck plays Sam Varner, a retiring Army scout who agrees to escort a woman and her half-Apache son to safety. What follows is less a traditional Western and more a suspense thriller. The boy's Apache father, a ruthless warrior, begins hunting them across the desert. The movie unfolds like a cat-and-mouse game. There aren't endless shootouts. Instead, there's silence, shadows, and the ever-present sense of being watched. Director Robert Mulligan, who also directed To Kill a Mockingbird, uses restraint instead of bombast. The result is unnerving. Peck delivers a performance full of quiet tension. He's not a gunslinger eager for violence. He's a man desperate to protect innocent lives while knowing that danger is closing in. The film's villain, Salvaje, is kept mostly unseen, which only adds to the fear. When the final showdown comes, it's stripped of glamour, just raw survival. Audiences in 1968 weren't ready. They wanted the boldness of spaghetti westerns or the blood-soaked style of Peckinpah. The Stalking Moon felt too subdued, and it slipped away. But looking back, its slow-burn suspense feels ahead of its time, closer to a modern thriller than a dusty shoot-'em-up. For Peck, it proved he could anchor a western without relying on heroics. For us, it's a buried gem that deserves a second look. Day of the Evil Gun, 1968. Glenn Ford built his career on playing smooth, likable leads. But in Day of the Evil Gun, he gave audiences something different. Ford plays Lorne, Warfield, a former gunslinger, forced back into violence when his ex-wife and children are kidnapped by Apaches. Alongside him is Arthur Kennedy as Owen Forbes, a neighbor who secretly loves Warfield's wife. That triangle of loyalty, resentment, and rivalry gives the story its bite. Unlike the flashy spaghetti westerns dominating the late 60s, Day of the Evil Gun is stripped down and tense. The action is brutal, but the focus is on character conflict. Warfield doesn't want to go back to killing. He's done with that life. But every mile of his journey drags him deeper into bloodshed. Ford plays the role with weary conviction, giving us a man torn between his past and his duty. Kennedy is the perfect counterbalance. Charming, selfish, and jealous, he complicates every decision Warfield makes. The two men's uneasy alliance simmers until it inevitably explodes. It's less about the rescue mission and more about watching two flawed men unravel under pressure. The movie didn't get the recognition it deserved. Released at a time when audiences wanted either John Wayne's larger-than-life presence or Leone's operatic violence, it fell into the cracks. But rewatch it now, and it stands out as one of Ford's sharpest late-career performances. A Western not about glory, but about the ghosts men carry when they pick up a gun again. The Unforgiven, 1960. No, not the Clint Eastwood film from the 90s. This Unforgiven came 3 decades earlier, directed by John Huston. It starred Burt Lancaster and Audrey Hepburn in a story that wasn't afraid to dig into uncomfortable territory. The Zachary family lives in Texas, respected and prosperous, until rumors spread that Hepburn's character may have native ancestry. Suddenly, the community that once embraced them turns hostile, and the family is forced into a violent standoff. This wasn't your standard 1960 Western. Houston used it to confront prejudice head-on, and the results were uneasy. Lancaster gives a fierce performance as the protective brother, while Hepburn, though cast against her usual type, delivers one of her most vulnerable roles. The supporting cast, including Lillian Gish and Audie Murphy, adds even more weight. Behind the scenes, the shoot was chaos. Hepburn suffered a horseback accident that nearly ended her career. Houston clashed with the studio, pushing for a darker film than MGM wanted. In the end, the movie landed somewhere in between, too dark for audiences expecting light entertainment, too mainstream for critics to hail as radical. Over time, The Unforgiven has been largely forgotten, overshadowed by both Hepburn's romances and Lancaster's bigger hits. But dig it up today, and you'll find a bold Western that dared to say something about race, family, and loyalty long before it was fashionable. A buried film that deserves its place among the decade's most daring. So there you have it, 15 Westerns from the 1960s that Hollywood let slip through the cracks. Some were too quiet, some too strange, some just unlucky. But all of them prove that the decade wasn't just about spaghetti epics or John Wayne blockbusters. These buried gems remind us that the genre had more depth, grit, and soul than people remember. Which one surprised you most? Drop your thoughts below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more cinematic deep dives.